On a late-night talk show set in the mid-2000s, the host asked a question that wasn't on the card, and for a moment, the studio audience didn't know whether to laugh. It happened quickly, the way these things usually do. The interview had been moving along the way these segments always moved. A few minutes of conversation, a few prepared questions, the kind of back and forth designed to lead naturally toward a clip or a bit that had been arranged ahead of time. Everyone in that studio, from the host to the camera operators to the audience filling the seats under the bright lights, understood the rhythm of a segment like this one. It had a shape. It had a destination. And for most of those few minutes, it was moving exactly where everyone expected it to go. And then the host asked something that wasn't part of that shape at all. To understand why that single, unscripted question mattered the way it did, it helps to understand what late-night television looked like in the mid-2000s, and what it meant for a comedian to sit in that chair. Late-night talk shows during this era operated on a structure that had been refined over decades. A guest segment wasn't really a conversation in the way conversations usually work. It was a carefully built sequence, mapped out in advance by producers and writers, designed to move from one beat to the next with a rhythm that felt spontaneous to the audience at home, but was, in almost every case, the product of careful planning. Questions were prepared. Topics were cleared in advance. Even the moments that looked the most off the cuff, a host leaning back and laughing, a guest seeming to go off on a tangent, were, more often than not, exactly where the segment had been designed to go. Behind that polish was a process that started long before the cameras rolled. Earlier in the day, a producer would typically sit down with the guest, sometimes in person, sometimes over the phone, and walk through the topics likely to come up, the stories that played well, the general direction the host wanted the conversation to take. These conversations weren't scripts in the strictest sense. Nobody handed a guest lines to memorize. But by the time a guest walked out from behind the curtain and sat down in that chair, both the guest and the host generally had a shared understanding of where the next several minutes were headed, which stories would get told, which topics would be touched on, and roughly how long each beat would last before the segment moved to the next one. This wasn't a secret, exactly, but it also wasn't something audiences thought about while watching. Television in this era moved with enough polish that the seams didn't show. A guest would sit down, the host would ask a few questions, the guest would tell a story or deliver a bit that had likely been rehearsed in some form beforehand. The audience would laugh, and the segment would end on cue, often with enough time built in for the host to tease whatever was coming next. It was a system that worked because everyone involved understood their role in it, and because, for the most part, nothing happened that fell outside of it. The studio itself reinforced that sense of structure. Late-night sets in this era were bright, tightly controlled spaces. A host's desk, a guest chair angled just slightly toward the camera, a band or house musicians positioned off to one side, an audience close enough to be part of the energy of the show, but arranged in a way that kept their reactions from overwhelming the conversation. Floor managers stood just out of frame, holding cue cards and watching the clock, ready to signal when a segment needed to wrap. Every element of the set existed to support the rhythm of the show, to make sure that whatever happened on camera felt natural, even though almost nothing about the environment itself was left to chance. For a comedian appearing on a show like this, sitting in that chair carried its own particular weight, separate from the weight of performing stand-up. On a stand-up stage, a comedian controlled almost everything: the material, the pacing, the direction of the set. In a talk show interview, control shifted. The host asked the questions. The segment had a structure the guest didn't write. A comedian could prepare stories, prepare lines, prepare the kind of polished anecdotes that played well on television, but ultimately, the shape of the conversation belonged to someone else. By the time of this particular appearance, Katt Williams had done enough television to understand that rhythm well. Television appearances had become a regular part of his career during this period. Not a replacement for stand-up, but a complement to it. A way of reaching audiences who might never set foot in a comedy club, but who would, on any given night, be sitting in front of a television when a familiar comedian walked out from behind a curtain. Each appearance carried its own version of the pre-show conversation with producers, its own rough map of where the segment was likely to go, its own quiet understanding of what worked on television versus what worked on a stage. He knew how these segments worked, knew the kinds of questions that tended to come up, knew how to take a prepared story and deliver it in a way that felt natural rather than rehearsed, even when it wasn't entirely spontaneous. That skill, the ability to make planned material feel alive in the moment, was itself a kind of craft, one that took years to develop, and one that audiences rarely thought about because, when done well, it was invisible. It required a different kind of attention than stand-up did, less about reading a room of strangers, more about reading a single person across a desk, anticipating where a conversation might bend, and being ready to follow it there while still landing wherever the segment needed to land. The segment that night had been moving the way these segments moved. A few minutes in, following the rhythm of the conversation, the host asked a follow-up question. The kind of question that, on the surface, seemed like a natural extension of whatever had just been discussed. It wasn't an aggressive question. It wasn't designed to provoke. By most accounts, it was simply a question that occurred to the host in the moment, prompted by something in the conversation, and asked the way people ask follow-up questions in any conversation, without much thought about where it might lead. But it wasn't on the card, and for a moment, that mattered more than anything else in the room. There's a particular shift that happens on a television set when something departs from the plan. Subtle, but real. Crew members positioned around the studio, used to anticipating exactly where a segment was headed based on the rundown they'd been given, register a kind of recalibration. Cameras that had been framed for an expected next beat adjust slightly. The audience, picking up on something in the host's tone or the pause that follows a question, leans forward almost without realizing it. None of this is dramatic. None of it would necessarily be visible to someone watching at home, but in the room, it's felt. A brief moment where the structure of the segment, usually invisible because it's so reliable, suddenly becomes apparent precisely because something has stepped outside of it. Katt Williams paused. It wasn't a long pause, a second, maybe two, but it was long enough to register, in a medium where pauses are usually filled, where dead air is something hosts and guests alike are trained to avoid. For a second or two, nothing happened. The studio audience, sensing the shift without being able to name it, went quiet in the particular way audiences go quiet when they're not sure whether something funny is about to happen or something else entirely. Somewhere off to the side, a floor manager who had been tracking the segment against the clock paused too, pen hovering over a rundown sheet, waiting to see which direction the moment would go before marking anything down. And then he answered. What he said wasn't a joke. Not in the way the segment up to that point had been built around jokes. It was a short answer, direct, delivered with the same comic timing he used on stage, but without anything underneath it that was reaching for a laugh. The words themselves, when people who were there have described them since, were simple, a few sentences, maybe less, addressing the question honestly, the way someone might answer a question from a friend, rather than from a television host in front of a studio audience and several million people watching at home. What made the moment strange, what made it stand out to the people in that studio, and to those who have talked about it since, wasn't the content of the answer itself, exactly. It was where it seemed to be directed. To anyone watching, the answer was given to the host, the way every answer in an interview is given to the host. But something about the tone, the brief pause beforehand, the way Katt Williams seemed to be looking slightly past the host rather than at him, gave the impression, to those paying close attention, that the answer wasn't really for the person who asked the question at all. It felt, to the people who noticed it, like the answer was meant for someone else, someone not in that studio, someone who couldn't have been watching that broadcast in any literal sense, but who the answer seemed to be addressed to anyway. Nobody in that studio could have said, in the moment, who that might have been. The host didn't follow up on it. By most accounts, the moment passed quickly enough that the host may not have registered anything unusual at all, simply moving the segment forward the way hosts do, filling the brief silence with the next question on the card, restoring the rhythm that had been interrupted for those few seconds. The audience laughed at whatever came next, the way audiences do, and the segment continued toward whatever it had been built to reach. But for the people who noticed, a handful of crew members, perhaps a producer watching from off-camera, anyone close enough to register the shift in tone, that moment stayed with them. Not because anything dramatic had happened. By any objective measure, nothing had. A question was asked, an answer was given, and the show went on. But there had been something underneath that answer that didn't quite match the segment around it. Something that felt less like television and more like a person, briefly, talking to someone who wasn't there. Looking back, the most likely explanation, the one that fits everything else known about Katt Williams during this period of his career, isn't mysterious in the way it might first seem. Comedians who build a career out of observation, out of looking closely at the world and at themselves, often carry with them an ongoing kind of internal conversation with the people who doubted them, with earlier versions of themselves, with the rooms they used to perform in before rooms like television studios were part of their lives at all. An unscripted question, landing at the right moment, can sometimes reach past the prepared answers and brush up against that internal conversation directly. Not because the comedian intends to reveal it, but because, for a second, there's nowhere else for an honest answer to come from. If the answer that night was addressed to someone, it likely wasn't addressed to anyone watching that broadcast at all. It was addressed to the version of Katt Williams who existed before any of this, before the television appearances, before the bigger stages, before any of it was guaranteed. The performer that had been built, slowly, over years of clubs and small rooms and uncertainty, answering a question on behalf of the person who had once wondered whether any of it would happen. That's speculation, of course, the kind of thing that can never be confirmed, because the moment itself was never explained by Katt Williams or by anyone else who was there. But it's the explanation that fits the feeling people described afterward. Not confusion, not concern, just the sense of having witnessed something brief and real, slipped in between two scripted moments, gone again before anyone could be sure they'd seen it at all. The broadcast continued. The segment ended on schedule, the way segments always did. Whatever had happened in those few seconds was absorbed back into the larger flow of the show, indistinguishable to anyone watching at home from any other moment in the interview. But for the people in that studio, the ones who felt the shift, who noticed the pause, who sensed that an answer had gone somewhere it wasn't supposed to go, it became one of those small, specific memories that occasionally surface years later. Not a story with a clear ending, not something that ever made headlines, just a question that wasn't on the card, an answer that seemed to be meant for someone else, and a studio that, for a few seconds, felt very different than it had a moment before. What that moment revealed about Katt Williams wasn't anything dramatic. It wasn't a confession or a grievance or anything that needed explaining. It was something quieter. The reminder that even in the most controlled environments, even in segments built minute by people whose job was to make sure nothing unexpected happened, a single, honest answer could still slip through. Not because anyone planned it, because, for a second, a real question had been asked, and the most honest response happened to be the one that came out. Looking back at that broadcast now, what stands out isn't the segment itself, or even the joke that followed and got the laugh the show was built around. What stands out is the pause, a second, maybe two, and the few words that came after it, spoken to a host in front of an audience, but seeming, to anyone paying close attention, to be meant for someone else entirely. That's the part of the story most people never heard. Not the segment, not the laugh that came after, but a brief, unscripted answer given to a question that wasn't supposed to be asked, addressed to someone who was never named and never explained, by the only person who would have known who that was.